we're going to go over, low, high, and then strength training, because I think those are kind of it's a little bit of an oversimplification, but those are the three easiest buckets to put the training architecture in. Low intensity is probably the biggest bucket because it is where you're going to spend the most time of your training duration. And I would also argue it's the most important of the three to get right. So there's a couple of overriding principles here that I think are important to understand. Probably the biggest one for folks is that this kind of training in general needs to be certainly high frequency and ideally then also fairly high volume. For most individuals, they're going to want to do some of this kind of training at kind of a minimum of 4 days a week, in my opinion, to start moving the needle in a positive direction for their aerobic fitness. And even, 5 or 6 days a week in some way, shape, or form is appropriate for more intermediate to advanced athletes. The bread and butter, and the underpinnings of everybody's training program for mountaineering and for all endurance sports, in my mind, needs to be that low intensity work, right? And that needs to be there in the base phase, and it also needs to be there in in the more specific phases later in training, no matter what. But as you've done that work and as sort of you've made those improvements, there's room and it's appropriate to start layering in other training intensities. The most obvious one is, quote, high intensity training. And this, in one slide, this is an incredibly gross oversimplification of intensity training. In general, for most folks, it's 1 to 2 days a week will have some kind of intensity. 1 day a week works really well considering all the other things you're trying to cram in a training week. In my mind, it's not a substitute at any point for the low intensity work. In that once you get to this phase of training and you're going to layer in some high intensity work, I think one of the big errors is to really back off of the volume of low intensity work. And you have to make room for it in your calendar and you have to make room for it physiologically to recover from. But you can't chop half of the low intensity work out of the program just to layer this in, because that will greatly erode your aerobic capacity, which is the very thing we're trying not to do. Of the buckets, this is, in my mind, the one that has the most variability between athletes, and for a couple of reasons. One, where individual athletes are just with their training history varies wildly for me on this one. Some people, they're lifelong gym users and are quite strong. If we're thinking only about what we need to do to improve their abilities for the goal climbs, they probably have very little work to do in this realm. Other folks, might be on the other end spectrum. Maybe, you have folks that have never strength trained or never set foot in a gym. And if their goals demand it, they would want to spend quite a bit of time strength training. So with regards to the goal, I think it's really important for an individual athlete to take a kind of critical look at where they are now and where they need to be for that goal. And the other thing, just the nature of our sport, is something that's low to moderate altitude, that is unladen and doesn't have a high degree of technicality, in and of itself probably doesn't have a huge strength demand. And, all the strength training in the world isn't going to make you dramatically more well prepared for that. The other end of the spectrum, and I always like to use Denali as an example here, some of these goals are multi-day and just the nature of the climbs are such that you have a lot of equipment with you. It's very heavy, and just physically moving that stuff around is really demanding, especially for athletes that don't have a strength history, or maybe athletes that are, a little smaller framed and just have less body mass, because it's the amount of equipment that you have to carry doesn't vary wildly between individuals, but, people's strength varies wildly. So think critically about, what your goal is and how to be ready for that.